Hi everyone, I am Lauren Tram and I partnered with Will on this project. And we found out through corresponding that we both have an interest in wetland mitigation and stream mitigation, which is where you create or restore impaired wetlands or streams and sell them for profit, usually.
Yes, I'm Will Detweiler, William Detweiler, as y'all all know me by. I'm partnered with Lauren, interested in mitigation. We have had a past history with some mitigation. Specifically, I've been a part of some delineations before, and I was always very curious to what the process meant and how to do it.
Started as a project manager for Mars this summer, so it's a relatively new position for me actually doing mitigation on the ground. Mars is an in-lieu fee program, so we don't do, it's kind of like there's like banks, in-lieu fee, and permittee responsible. So fee basically like if the Department of Transportation causes a wetland impact, then they buy credits from us for however many acres they impacted. And so we do basically like a mitigation bank is when the restoration has been completed before the impact. But in our case, we have to go after the impact has occurred and find a project site. Montana doesn't have a ton of development compared to other states, so we don't have like tons of permits coming in. So we kind of work all over the state. I've kind of been realizing lately that a lot of the impacts that we're mitigating for, like it's like slices of wetlands along a railroad or a road that are just like full of invasive species.
Yeah.
They weren't like necessarily natural wetland areas to begin with. Even if it's not exactly in kind, we can like lump together funds from different projects and do a really good project in that same watershed, even if it's not like exactly replacing what was lost.
If you could just share an overview of your research, of your background, that would be great.
I did my master's a few years ago for the University of Montana, focusing on wetland mitigation from a wildlife perspective. So looking mostly at amphibians and invertebrate use of created wetlands in northwest Wyoming near Grand Teton National Park. That led me to a couple different jobs, but then I ended up back in Montana working for Montana Aquatic Resources, and we are the statewide in-lieu fee provider for mitigation in Montana. So I am a project manager, so I basically am seeing mitigation projects through from beginning to end. From like when we get a credit sale, we do a bunch of outreach to landowners and other conservation organizations in whatever watershed we're working in. And then once we find a site, we are kind of involved with the entire design process, all the way through like performance monitoring and evaluation. So that's kind of what my current job is in a nutshell.
That's definitely our dream. There's no doubt about it.
I know. Can you share maybe some of the research methods that you've used to evaluate those banks or that you've used in the past?
Yeah, so during my master's, like I said, I was in a wildlife biology program. And so I was focused on looking at like species assemblages and species richness and community composition of invertebrates. And then I used occupancy models to look at amphibian use of those wetlands. The performance measures that we use for the work that I'm doing now are a little bit different from that. We basically come up with different performance standards for each individual project based on what the objectives are. And they're usually pretty focused on like vegetation and hydrology and soils, keeping in mind the wildlife objectives too. So it's just not realistic to do like a full-on academic study of every single.
Right. As these ecosystems we are trying to replicate with mitigation are so complex, as I'm sure we all know. Do you think that no net loss as a policy for the United States is enough? Or do we need more mitigation in order to preserve the amount of ecosystem services that are provided by wetlands? As an example, one of your papers talked about how let's see, wetlands cover just 2% of the greater Yellowstone area, but they provide services for up to 90% of the species.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it kind of comes down to like what your values and like that's kind of like a society question probably. We're required usually to replace 1.5 times the amount of either acreage or functional units that was lost. So often it's not really a one-to-one no net loss policy on the ground that is supposed to account for the temporal loss. So like because we're doing mitigation after the impacts have occurred, the Army Corps requires us to offset a greater amount of wetland area or function compared to what was impacted. So who knows whether that's really enough. I think Mars is a really great organization because we kind of have that ability to pool funding, and then we can work with a bunch of different partners to do really high quality mitigation. That's our goal. So like we can, for example, we did a project recently with a watershed group in Missoula who they were like already doing a stream restoration project, but we kind of were able to add on funding and kind of do like a value added project, and they were able to like expand their restoration footprint. So they weren't getting mitigation credit for most of that project, but we were able to like provide enough funding that the whole project could actually happen.
How would you measure success? And could you tell us what success looks like, in Montana and the banks you've worked on, the mitigation banks you have worked in and on?
Yeah, so I guess just first of all, again, what we're doing aren't mitigation banks. So mitigation banks are when that's when like investors invest money up front and then they buy credits after. So just it's like not just kind of a matter of semantics, but for the in lieu fee, we're doing in lieu fee mitigation. But we measure success kind of differently for each project. So each project will have its own set of objectives that we come up with depending on whether, like, for example, one project I'm working on, one of the objectives is to like improve water quality of irrigation return flows, or another project could be like the goal could be to reduce sediment inputs into a creek. And so those are like specific objectives that we can then come up with performance standards to measure. And often those performance standards are really tied to just replacing wetland area. So it's kind of like we have to replace 4 acres of wetlands. So we're going to measure like, vegetation, hydrology, and soils and come up with metrics for like if we're trying to replace a scrub wetland, then we'll come up with like a % cover threshold for woody vegetation. So it's really dependent on the project, I would say.
I'm very interested in the regional differences. So the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem has a unique characteristic assemblage. In a restoration perspective, does this physical environment and regional differences of this ecosystem bring unique aspects of the processes of mitigation and or achieving the attributes of successful restoration?
Yeah, I think the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, the things that are kind of unique from a restoration perspective is that it's really high elevation and cold. So that makes it just take longer than it would in the southeast to like get vegetation established and things like that. And so that's something that doesn't necessarily get reflected in like policy, but often for these projects, there's like a 5-year performance period, and we have to meet our credit obligation by the end of 5 years, which is okay. But I think when it's like those performance periods, it might be good for them to be adjusted based on the regional environment. And then of course, like Eastern Montana is super different from Western Montana. And if you're like high elevation or low elevation. So yeah, all those things kind of would factor into like what the species, that's why it's really important to use like reference sites to determine what species you're going to plant and what your performance standards are going to be.
Since you have a research background in mitigation, what do you think could be done in the planning process to improve outcomes? So for example, your paper, species-specific responses to wetland mitigation among amphibians in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, discussed how the depth of wetlands
possibly creating an ecological trap for amphibian larvae?
From a wildlife perspective, there's a lot that could be done. I think often, like for I guess my background is mostly in wildlife, so that's kind of what I'm most comfortable talking about. We often have these objectives in our site plans that are like very broad, that are like improved habitat for wildlife, without really specifying what species we're targeting. We're just like, if we build a wetland, like the wildlife will come and it'll be great. But I think that it's really important to think about the specific species that you are wanting to benefit, because with that amphibian paper, there's 4 species of amphibians here, and they all have different life history requirements. So depending on like what species you want to attract and create good habitat for, you're going to want to design a wetland differently, perhaps. So I think like keeping in mind the specific species that you're trying to benefit is really important. And it could just be increasing species richness, which would just be like making sure that you're creating a wide diversity of habitats in the area that you're working in. So I think it just depends.
Do you find that there's room in the planning process to add those objectives?
Yeah, I'm trying to do that a little bit, because I definitely come from like a little bit of a different background than a lot of people in this field. A lot of people doing the design come from like an engineering background. It's like really important to have like a whole team of people with different backgrounds. But I think I am really interested in trying to create good habitat for wildlife. So trying to like refine our performance standards and objectives a little bit to actually measure habitat quality is something that I'm interested in doing. But it's also hard because we have a limited budget and limited amount of time to do things. So kind of a balance of being realistic and trying to do really good projects.